We are delighted to be welcoming Amanda remotely. So Amanda, are you there? Yes, fantastic. Hi Amanda, can you hear me?
I can, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome, and our audio levels are great in the room to hear you as well. So without too much delay, we're going to hand over. Amanda, take it away.
Thank you so much. Hello again, and thank you everyone for joining me today to talk about navigating the murky areas where ethical, legal, and policy challenges present when measuring open source. So to start off, some admin notes. For those whom it helps, you can find these slides and very detailed speaker notes at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/OSS-RAINBOWSNEK2023-slides. I would also like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the various lands on which I am calling from today. I'm joining you from the land which has served as a site of sustenance, community, meeting, and exchange among indigenous peoples since time immemorial. The Western Abenaki are the traditional stewards of these forests, lands, and waters, in which they call Inda Kina, or homeland. We respect their spiritual and lived connections to this region, and remember the hardships they've endured, both past and present, including violence and forced displacement at the hands of colonizing peoples. As we gather for this physically dispersed and virtually constructed meeting, as we share our own knowledge, teaching, and learning practices, may we give thanks for the opportunity to share in the joys of this place and protect it. I would also like to let everyone know that I will be speaking today both directly and indirectly about exclusion, the potential and reality of harm against marginalized groups, and how technology can be used to identify people who have not chosen that. If these topics are best covered elsewhere, in a different format, or not at all for you, I wish you all the warmth and best community this space has to offer. You will have time before I get into these topics to not be present anymore in the space if that works best for you. So some context about myself. I am a pale white woman with light hair and eyes who wears glasses. My hair is different now. I am a researcher and engineer at Google, where I'm currently leading a team focused on research and education in our open source programs office. I'm also one of Google's co-leads for Project Ocean and Across, with the indomitable Katie McLaughlin, who I know is also part of this lovely community. External faculty for the Vermont Complex Systems Center, and I'm also a co-founder for Open Source Stories with Julia Ferrioli. I sit on the board of directors for the Computational Democracy Project. I once wrote a book with Alice Zhang on feature engineering. I'm also queer, a very proud mama of two smaller humans, a U.S. Navy veteran, and I'm lucky enough to live currently in the state of Vermont in the United States. And while I am fortunate enough to be here, my state and the areas I love continue to experience life-altering flooding as the direct result of human-accelerated climate change. If you want to learn more about what Vermont is experiencing and how you can help, Vermont Public Radio has consistently the most accurate coverage and updates for our local communities and those who care about us. I tell all of you this because it's important for us to share and understand where we come from, and since I cannot be there with you today, it is important for you to know where my heart and my head is as we talk today. So, to kick off the conversation, I wanted to talk about where I started with working in this space. In 2019, I was working in Google Cloud as a developer relations engineering manager with a wonderful team and a nagging feeling about the general understanding of how open source worked. So basically, I had this kind of research idea that I couldn't figure out where to put or what to do with. And fortunately, many of my friends from Google also frequent the half bakery of ideas and love to introduce you to the friends you haven't met yet. And this is how I met Julia Ferrioli of the Open Source Programs Office. Together, we developed and pitched the idea for what would become Project Ocean, a pilot for the team in moving forward academic, industry, and community research of open source at a global scale. So despite launching a new initiative in early 2020, we were still able to achieve many of the goals we had, and the work continues with a range of internal, academic, and community partners today. One of our most audacious goals was mapping out the entire open source ecosystem and then sharing it with everyone. And honestly, at the time, it didn't feel that audacious, because we're Google. We know how to organize information and make it accessible and useful, or so I was told. But one of the first barriers we continued to run against was defining the problem space of open source with our stakeholders and the communities we work with. There are many mental models and analogies about open source that exist. Some of these models aid our understanding of a complex ecosystem. However, we found that we don't challenge these enough to truly investigate the risks and the problems in open source now, rather than continually building for how we've been burned previously. We lack sufficient baselines to gain a true census of how many people are involved in open source, how many people are holding up our technical world, and where we might be at risk of the whole modern tech stack simply falling to the ground. Organizationally, this means that we can't move forward effectively and sustainably until we break the popular but over-reductionist model of modern digital infrastructure. So this XKCD comic is frequently shown to demonstrate the gaps that exist in both our understanding and our failure to adequately respond to the challenge of shoring up open source. More often than not, it's used to show that the brittleness of the open source ecosystem and why further large-scale investment is critical. My counter to this comic, as developed with Nikki Ringland, is that the reality of open source is that billions of dollars are already spent globally on sustaining open source. So the initial comic has been used effectively to centralize buckets of money, attention, and power, and to build walls around organizational spaces for collaboration. However, it isn't that we aren't investing, it's that we are making localized decisions about investment and support for open source while we lack a resilient way to approach a global, decentralized, and equitably resourced ecosystem. Black swans of open source past are frequently cited as the risk we will see happen again if we don't invest in a centralized initiative now, and maybe yesterday. And this may be true, or it may be that despite any amount of investment or organization, the next problem will present itself in a way that will also only be clearly visible through hindsight. So this brings us to the impetus behind mapping out open source ecosystems as Julie and I envisioned it for Project Ocean. Quite simply, we are looking for that magic spot of any research which allows us to have better data and better models so that we can make better data-informed decisions. We want to know where we are so that we can work collectively in our communities to figure out where to go next. So along the way, with my many collaborators and colleagues, as I said, including your very own Katie McLaughlin, who I believe we call Glassant, we have found ourselves frequently in the spots on the map that remain unclear, where there's no clear policy or approach to navigating the data and abstract representation of open source. So this is where cartographers frequently mark as the RB dragons on their maps, the fuzzy places which may hold treasure or danger. And so today I'd like to walk through a few of these areas, specifically around the ethical, legal, and policy challenges we continue to navigate. And as much as I'd like to have clear, well-lit paths for you to also navigate these waters, I don't. I can share what I've learned, what we should talk about as a community, and what questions researchers can ask themselves when approaching the same challenge. My hope is that together we continue to challenge assumptions, avoid the most harm, and find the best way forward each time we approach the home of a dragon. So first, let's explore some of the ethical challenges which arise when working within research about open source. One of the key cultural tenets of open source software and the communities that build around it is working in the open. This places much, but not all, of the conversation about these communities online in a way that is visible to anyone who wants to join the effort. This is the intent. Be open to make work, community, and innovation transparent. There's a subset of the larger open source movement which identifies as free software. One could argue it's the opposite way. Open source is a subset of free software. We're not here to debate that today. But here, free hinges on the concept of libre rather than tied to a cost savings measure. This is a very different concept than open or free, meaning please scrape our data and tell us about ourselves. There is no universal consent form that any one person or community is signing up for when placing their information online. Yet this is how we've been advancing our knowledge of the problems that exist in open source and advocating for their resolution. The ethical challenge here: when and where can we assume consent for online content to be analyzed? How do we even find and respect these barriers when they are so unclear? This brings us to the next ethical challenge, which primarily applies to folks working in institutions with IRBs. For those not familiar, IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, which review research studies to ensure that they comply with applicable regulations, meet communally accepted ethical standards, follow institutional policies, and adequately protect research participants. And as we just talked about the lack of explicit consent to be a test subject in aggregate, there is an institutional gap that many IRBs do not require review of analysis and research when it is conducted in aggregate from metadata, such as the kind that you collect from platform APIs. So even if the markers of the metadata could potentially be identifying, such as mailing list information where email addresses and location data do not adequately provide anonymization, individuals whose work is represented are not considered to be research participants for data which already exists and is open to many. So this brings the ethical challenge for us. When and where do we and how do we identify when a research study should be reviewed by IRB? And how do we advocate for that kind of oversight within the research community? When is it beneficial to the group being studied? When is it actually not a necessary step towards framing ethical research problems? This brings us to the next step of problem framing. Humans are complex creatures. As much as it serves reducing the problem space, no one person readily sits in a single-dimensional cluster. When we fail to recognize this, we are at risk of problem framing becoming too reductive. We have to ask when and where are we actively erasing people or reducing their identities to vectors which become harmful when applied to policy. One for all is not all for one. We must continue to be conscientious of categorization and reductionism of identities to single categories. So continue on with the concept and challenge of self-identification markers. We must always be aware that people from vulnerable communities may and do intentionally separate their identities across multiple online communities and spaces. Now more than ever, we have to be aware of how our aggregated work may unintentionally place someone from a digital space into a place where physically they may be subject to real-world consequences because of who they are and how they exist in the world. So this brings us to a fundamental technique of working within open source research. We're combining information across multiple trace systems to gain a more complete picture of a community is a common technique. For example, if we want to see how software changes over time or community changes over time, we may combine data from working software repositories, issue trackers, and maintainer mailing lists. Since not every system identifier is the same, we can use anti-aliasing methods to consolidate work to individuals. Here, I refer to anti-aliasing as sampling techniques to combine information to single identifiers. The ethical challenge question this brings us is, does anti-aliasing across datasets potentially create opportunities for harm for members of open source communities? We talked before about how individuals may separate themselves online across digital spaces. One of these specific separations is when a trans person who works in open source moves their work and digital identity as they come out as trans. They may not change over all of their professional and community work from their dead name to their present identity. When this is uncovered through inferred methods, how do we honor the person and their life who we have unintentionally outed beyond their original trusted community? The impetus and the work is not on them, it is on us as researchers to make sure that we are honoring the people in the spaces we are working with. So we're going to pause on ethical challenges for now to wade into the waters where lawyers hesitate to be cited. Quick note, this is a picture of a lawyer who accidentally used a chat product filter to show themselves as a cat during a trial online in 2020. Now, I am not a lawyer and I am not a cat, but any good lawyer cat gets super fidgety when engineers talk about legal matters. So I will not get into exact specifics today, but I will generally refer to things about regulations and laws and other good ideas which I think maintain good social structure and I approve wholeheartedly of when they're used fairly and not used against people to be able to keep them in oppressive states. Please consult your own lawyer cats as needed for further clarification, advice, and the dark matters to avoid. Again, I am not a lawyer and I'm not your lawyer, but when I talk with lawyer cats about data and what is data and where the law sees what is data, we get into some very twisty-turny conversations. There is no global legal standard on what is information, what is data, and what is the differentiation between data and a data set. So even more complex is that there's no universal legal standard of what data is. Who information belongs to, what is public, what is open, and how we can apply that across all the different use cases. So when you see open data, you have to keep in mind that open to use may not be open to us, depending on who that us is. So yes, Amanda, you may say, but what about this concept I hear about in copyright law, which refers to fair use? Not like anyone's talking about that these days. Again, this is not standardized across every country, institution, organization, and industry. The most recent advances in text generation and summarization have revisited and accelerated the challenges to what exactly constitutes fair use. So if you want to give your favorite intellectual property lawyer cat a headache, ask them what's currently changing or up for change in legislation, regulation, and case law surrounding fair use and large language models. I've included in the references one recent viewpoint from Van Lindbergh, who also wrote a book on intellectual property and open source. In the meantime, there are licensing standards that exist and are used by open source communities to explain how you can use the information they post online. Where we get into legal challenges here is what license and terms and condition applies where and for what use. So open source software, by definition, falls under licenses as outlined by the open source definition and held by the Open Source Institute. However, metadata about the software, which is the data exhaust created by the platforms they use, proprietary or otherwise, and the license which apply to the data they use can all be different. So, in addition, some information depends on use, commercial versus non-commercial. Some depends on explicit licensing, or what it means when no license is attached at all, but the data was created by a citizen of a specific country. Eliminating the step of untangling these license and use cases is not something that can be skipped when designing a research problem concerning open source. So, we've talked about ethical and legal challenges, which are necessary building blocks to begin to address where policy challenges present themselves when researching open source communities. That was necessary. This is a lot. Okay, so one widely used governance model within open source is to have large foundations, capital L, capital F, shepherd projects and portfolios for open source maintainers, enabling them to offload some of the work to maintain a globally used technology product. However, this brings us back to the problem of aggregated consent and individual consent when working with data about people. When communities choose to work with larger foundations, sometimes a large foundation, capital L, capital F, when does that foundation begin to represent the individuals and collective groups within? What do communities give up when they join a larger organization, and what do they retain? Who ultimately gets to make this decision? Do they know they're making that decision? Do they know who they're making that decision for? Do they know who they continue to make that decision for? And when do they get to change that should they decide? Can foundations sign up projects and maintainers for larger initiatives, research studies? Can they change mandatory communication and operational platforms, terms, and conditions without the consent of the individual maintainer communities? I file this under policy because we may not always be aware of what visibility and privacy we are signing commitments to when we are joining a large organization, regardless of the good intent of either the organization or the project maintainers themselves. So what do we require of marginalized people in a community when a larger organization ethically drifts away from their best interests? Do they have to bring these themselves, or do their identities forward to confront those changes? How are we thinking about members of our communities when things start to drift and we have ethical challenges that no longer align, and how do we disentangle then from commitments that we may have signed? This all culminates into how we create community consent models and care of the commons, which allows for the people who create the data to have the most control over how it is used, who has access to it, and for what purposes. The platforms, both public and private, both commercial and non-commercial, that a community chooses to use ultimately places additional policy and conditions on their members in a way which not every person may fully agree to. As researchers, this returns us to the fundamental concept of building with and not for. Every open source project is a part of a larger socio-technical system. We cannot ignore the people for the bits. Speaking of not ignoring the people for the bits, you cannot ask me to talk about policy without talking about open source. I absolutely cannot leave any public space these days without taking the time to reinforce these 3 simple words, that open source matters. As someone who works for a big corporation, I am highly and always aware that not only does my precise language build trust, but the washing and generalizing of language allows all sorts of mega, evil, tyrannical acts to use their power and privilege to avoid accountability and responsibility. Thankfully for me, 2 of my included references, including Why Open Source Matters and just released today, Open for Business, Big Tech, Concentrated Power, and the Political Economy of Open AI, speak to this important issue even more thoroughly than we have time today. I would encourage every person here, and everyone who is not, to read these thoroughly and consider what is in your power to take action on the ideas and challenges presented by them. So while these challenges haven't been solved in the last 20-ish minutes, I do want to offer some tools to help move open source research and understanding forward. Absolutely shameless self-promotion. Together with Julia Ferrioli and Juniper Lovato, we recently published a set of best practices for open source researchers. We cover recommendations in the areas of data ethics, research best practices, respect and equity considerations, and how to approach ecosystem integrity while avoiding reductionist thinking. This is not an exhaustive list, but we hope it is a good starting point. If you have appetite for a book, 1 paper isn't enough. My first recommendation remains Data Feminism, the 2020 book by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein. It is expert, nuanced, and highly critical of their own methods, which I always appreciate. And if 1 book isn't enough, V. M. Bersuer's book, Forge Your Future with Open Source, will give you a deeper understanding of open source community work, how it's grown over time, where practitioners are present, and what kind of workflows they share online and why. This isn't a book to teach you about research best practices, but rather to teach you about how open source is the way it is now and where you can meet ecosystems where they are. And of course, the breadth and depth search through all of these references will pile up your paper pile even quicker than I can, including the one that's taking over my dog's bed. To end, I want to encourage you to keep asking yourself and each other the hard questions about how we design problems, what data we collect, and the conclusions we draw about these ecosystems. After all, we're all in this open source raft together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And can I just get everyone to keep applauding? Amanda, thank you for your persistence presenting remotely. It's difficult to present to a non-existent audience, but I can assure you there were giggles at IP property lawyer Cat. So thank you very much for your talk. We do have some time for a question or 2 if there's anything from the audience. Now I'm going to squint and see if we can see through the lights. Are there any questions here? Amanda, there's no immediate questions. I will share with everyone that Amanda will be more present in Discord throughout the conference and is more active on Mastodon than elsewhere. So if you'd like to reach out after the conference or during the conference, you can do so online. Amanda, we will take a break now. Thank you very much for joining us remotely and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.